the crowd opposition of Ivo Banac, the president of the Croatian Peasant Party. This was considered nothing but a complot between the Serbian and the Croatian bourgeoisie, something that was not in the interest of the working class and something that ought to be denounced and rejected. So this too was an aspect of a period, perhaps the worst in the history of the Comintern, that Stalin and his minions called the period of the Second Imperialist War. When the Soviet Union was sitting on the sidelines as Germany was occupying the North and West European countries, and as Britain increasingly fought alone against the fascist powers. Needless to say, this was ended very quickly with the beginning of the war in 1941. I would like to make a brief halt in this main line of my presentation to account for certain developments that have direct bearing on the case of the Kosovar Albanians. I have mentioned already that in 1924, the question of the rights of minorities, including the right of secession, was touched upon by the Third Land Conference of the Communist Party. I have mentioned also that in 1928, Dresden Congress, the Fourth Congress of the Communist Party that was held in illegality in the German city of Dresden, basically called for secession of various parts of Yugoslavia. It also specifically mentioned that the party was in favor of aid to the struggle of the partitioned, this is the direct quote, of partitioned and oppressed Albanian people for independent and united Albania. In other words, Kosovo, other parts of Yugoslavia with Albanian majorities had a right to join with Albania within a united Albanian state. That was the program of the Fourth Congress of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. Needless to say, after 1935, after the beginning of the Popular Front, this was turned about in the opposite direction. Federalism was now the official policy, but in 1940, at the Fifth Land Conference of the Communist Party that took place, again in illegality in Zagreb, the new paramount leader, Tito, went several steps back. Let's not forget that we are now in a period when Albania was occupied by fascist Italy, and in 1940, at this Fifth Land Conference in Zagreb, the new leadership is talking about support of the struggle for liberty and equality of the Arnaut minorities in Kosovo, Metohija, and the Sanjak. The terminology is extremely telling, but when it's not spelled out, what this really means is that there is no possibility of uniting these lands with Albania proper, among other reasons, although this is also not spelled out, because Albania is under fascist occupation. On the other hand, one of the reasons it's not spelled out is because the position on the so-called Second Imperialist War, official Comintern line, basically does not distinguish between the Western allies and the fascist powers. They are both equally enemies of the working class, so it really doesn't matter whether you are living in a British or an Italian colony. In any event, this was a step away from the decisions of the Dresden Congress, and it would have immediate consequences in organizational terms, precisely because of the volatile position of these areas, the regional committee of the Communist Party for Kosovo, which previously was under the control of the Montenegrin party organization, was now taken away from Montenegrin tutelage and attached directly to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. The consequences of this, of course, were far-reaching, but we ought to take into account that we are dealing with an organization that has practically no influence among the Albanians of Kosovo, among the Albanians generally in Yugoslavia. The Regional Committee of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia for Kosovo in 1940 had 270 members. Only 20 of these were Albanians, which is to say that the overwhelming majority of the party organization in Kosovo was made up of Serb and Montenegrin population. The war did not change this very much. The minority position of the Communist Party in Kosovo, which was basically held by the Serb and Montenegrin minorities, was changed hardly at all, although what the leadership tried to do was to influence the Albanian population through the influence that it exerted over the newly founded Communist Party in Albania, which of course the principal figures of the Kosovo Party organization organized at the behest of the Yugoslav Party leadership. Now, what this really meant is that this basically Serb organization of the Communist Party in Kosovo was trying to influence the Albanian majority through this newly established Albanian Communist Party. And it meant that Enver Hoxha in Albania would be forced increasingly to abandon the struggle for a united Albanian state. He ultimately was forced into this. The telling point was the abandonment in 1943 of the Mukje agreement, which had the prospect of united Albania as something that would unite the communists and the National Front, the non-communist resistance in Albania, which was abrogated by Enver Hoxha in favor of some potential plebiscites. But yet another extremely telling example of the attitudes of the Yugoslav Party leadership in Kosovo has to do with how it dealt with anti-fascist, but simultaneously anti-Yugoslav Albanian notables. One such person was Sulejman Riza, who wanted to collaborate with the communists, but was not in favor of any idea of re-establishment of Yugoslavia. This meant that, although he was originally invited to the meeting that would discuss the creation of a broad popular front, that he would, in the second stage, after his positions were crystallized, basically disinvited. In 1944, Kosovo was secured as the result of a joint action of both the Yugoslav partisans, the Albanian partisans from Albania proper, and the Bulgarian units. But this was only the beginning of stabilization of the area, precisely because the various national concerns of the Albanian majority were not met. You had, in March of 1945, a very broad uprising against the new Yugoslav authorities, in which Albanian partisan units actually participated, or in some cases refused to participate in repression. This is, of course, the famous case of Shaban Koluža, and it's an extremely telling aspect of where the situation would develop after 1945. When the National Liberation Council for Kosovo in 1945 asked for annexation of Kosovo within federal Serbia, this was done basically without any democratic review, and it would be reflected very clearly in everything that went into the status of Kosovo as an autonomous oblast region. Vojvodina had the status of pokrajina, of province. So even here there was a hierarchical difference. But of course, the best way of seeing the real practice of Yugoslav communists had to do with the structure of the party organization. For example, the Communist Party of Serbia, which was established in May of 1945, had 43 members of the Central Committee, of which only